Hello and welcome to this little island amid the ocean that YouTube is. Last time we looked into Ukraine's history, we learned that although a powerful force, civil strife, foreign incursions, and partitions would undermine and eventually divide the Cossacks, leading them to their demise and opening their defenses to the opposition. As chaos subsided, the Hetmanate on the left bank of the Dnieper would emerge as the center of Ukrainian political, cultural, and economic life. Although an entity with political autonomy rather than independent one, the Hetmanate would provide Ukrainians with a greater measure of self-government than what they had had since the Galician-Volhylian principalities. By the late 17th century, the Poles regained the right bank and the Zaporozhians asserted their autonomy on about one-third of the territory that was once controlled by Kamenelsky. Called by Ukrainians as Hetmanate, the left bank land was referred as Malorussia by Russians. The land included 10 regimental districts, and in the early 18th century the town Baturin served as the hetman's official residence and as the administrative capital of the land. With 11 major cities, 126 towns, and 1,800 villages, the Hetmanate was a well-developed territory. Yet, little had changed in the Hetmanate's Cossack government system since 1648, with the hetmans often failing to distinguish between their private funds and those of the Hetmanate. The finances were often in disarray, and despite the efforts, the key fiscal problem was never resolved. Possibly one of the main issues they faced was the erosion of income resulting from the privatization of public lands by Cossack officers, which would lead to the shrinking funds of office-related lands. The socio-economic landscape changed considerably, with the Starshina virtually excluding the common Cossacks from higher offices and decision-making process. The mounting economic difficulties experienced by common Cossacks were directly linked to their fortune's decline, with many Cossacks ruined due to the wars of the 17th and early 18th century. Moreover, the equipment, military principles, and techniques employed by the Cossacks had increasingly become outdated. Thus, by the 18th century, the Cossack army had become a mere shadow of the potent fighting force it had once been. Their leadership style had also shifted as the new generation of leaders concentrated themselves into adapting to the new political order rather than trying to outright challenge it. As Septuagint mentions, their aim was twofold, as they wished to maintain a good relationship with the Tsar, as well as consolidating their socio-economic gains. Whilst the Cossack leaders who were disillusioned with the Polish and Ottoman options were easily convinced of the importance of maintaining links to Moscow, the Cossack hetmans were committed to maintain what was left of the rights agreed on the Pereyaslav Agreement of 1654, in hopes by adopting a loyalist policy they could convince the Tsars of their reliability and be allowed to maintain their autonomy. One of the most important Ukrainian historical figures at the time, and perhaps one of the most controversial, was Ivan Mazepa. Born on the right bank in 1639 to a family highly respected in the Zaporozhian host, he studied at the Kiev Academy and attended the Jesuit college in Warsaw, later entering into service of the Polish king as gentleman in waiting. His international experience and intelligence would allow him to maneuver himself within the circle of the Tsars. And, in 1687, when Samoylovich was deposed, it was Mazepa who, backed by Russian officials, was elected as his successor. For most of his 21 years in office, Mazepa pursued the traditional policies of the left bank hetmans. With unparalleled consistency, he issued over 1,000 land grants to the Starshina, thereby greatly strengthening its position. Nor did he neglect his own interests. Thanks to generous grants from the Tsar and his own acquisitive instinct, the hetman managed to accumulate nearly 20,000 estates, thus becoming one of the wealthiest men in Europe. An avid patron of orthodoxy, Mazepa contributed a significant part of his own personal wealth to religious and cultural institutions. Yet, whilst his contribution to the arts and religion allowed him a favorable position with the higher ranks, his popularity with the common Cossacks and peasants was not as positive. In fact, common Cossacks and peasants often disliked and mistrusted the hetman due to his systematic support of the Starshina. In 1692, Petro Ivanenko Petrik began organizing an uprising against the hetman, proclaiming that the time had come to rise up against the blood-sucking Starshina and to tear away our fatherland Ukraine from Muscovite rule. Nonetheless, the revolt would soon die out as support dwindled and the Tatar allies turned against Petro and attacked the populace instead. According to Subtelny, one of Mazeppa's most impressive political skills was the ability to protect his own and Ukrainian interests while still maintaining good relations with Moscow. When Peter I came to power in 1689, the hetman became one of his most trusted men. When in 1702 a Cossack revolt broke on the Polish-controlled right bank, Mazeppa would take advantage of his position with the Tsar. With the Tsar occupied with the attack of Charles XII of Sweden, Mazeppa convinced him to sanction the occupation of the right bank, thus uniting the two halves of the Dnieper Ukraine. Yet, in early 18th century, Mazeppa's relation with the Tsar would change as the Great Northern War that had started in 1700 continued on and led Peter I to modernize his army, government and society, putting the Hetmanate's autonomy in jeopardy. For the first time, the Cossacks were expected to fight solely for the Tsar interests whilst facing modern foreign armies in far-off regions. Not only the Cossacks were no match for the rival armies, Russian and German officers that were assigned to the Cossack regiments viewed them as inferior and often used them as cannon fodder. Besides the growing uneasiness of the Starshina, the peasants and townsmen in Ukraine became growingly angry as Russian troops were installed in their towns or villages and mistreated the local population. The last straw on Mazeppa's relation with the Tsar came with the lack of protection provided to Ukraine. For when Charles XII's Polish ally threatened to invade Ukraine, Mazeppa turned to the Tsar for aid. Yet the reply was for Mazeppa to defend himself as best as he could, for the Tsar could not spare any men, thus breaking his commitment to defend Ukraine from the Poles, which constituted the basis of the 1654 treaty. With this, Mazeppa turned to the Swedes in hopes of sparing his land from devastation. The pact, concluded in 1709, established that, in return for military aid and provisions, Charles promised to protect Ukraine and to refrain from making peace with the Tsar until it was completely free from Moscow and its former rights restored. With the hetman defection, the capital at Baturin was attacked by the Russians, who massacred the population, installing a reign of terror. The Starshina that did not follow the hetman were quickly ordered to elect a new hetman, and on November 11, 1708, it chose Ivan Skoropadsky. Much of the Ukrainian population would refuse to join Mazeppa, in part for fear of what had happened in Baturin and intimidated by the surrounding Russian troops, but there was also a certain uneasiness with the Protestant Swedes. Surprisingly, the Zaporozhians sided with Mazeppa, as they considered him a lesser evil than the Tsar. Yet, in 1709, a Russian force would destroy the siege, and the Tsar issued an order for the immediate execution of any Zaporozhian that was captured. On June 28, 1709, at the Battle of Poltava, Peter I emerged victorious. For the Ukrainians, the battle marked the end of their attempts to break away from Russia. It was now only a matter of time before the Hetmanate would be completely absorbed in the expanding Russian Empire. Chased by the Russian cavalry, Mazeppa would seek refuge in Ottoman-ruled Moldavia, where he would die later that same year on September 21st. Within those who fled to Bender in Moldavia alongside Mazeppa were 50 leading members of the Starshina, 500 Cossacks from the Hetmanate, and over 4,000 Zaporozhians. Referred to as Mazeppists by historians, they effectively constituted the first Ukrainian political immigration, and in 1710 they would elect Pilip Orlik as their hetman in exile. Previously Mazeppa's chancellor, the new hetman knew the importance of gathering support. He would draft the Pacta et Constitutions, often referred to as Bender Constitution, in which the hetman prerogatives were limited, socioeconomic exploitation was to be eliminated, the Zaporozhian special status was to be preserved, and the hetman was to work for the political and ecclesiastical separation of Ukraine from Russia. Backed by Charles XII, Orlik concluded alliances with the Crimean Tatars and Ottomans, initiating a combined Zaporozhian Tatar attack against the Russians in Ukraine in 1711. Yet, despite initial success, the campaign would eventually fail. Wandering from one capital to another in search of aid, he never ceased to bombard French, Polish, Swedish, and Ottoman statesmen with manifestos about Ukraine's plight or to plan with his son, Hifjord, ways of freeing his homeland from the Muscovite yoke. The centralization of the Russian Empire was not immediate, especially as not all Tsars were as dedicated to it as Peter I had been. As Russia needed Ukrainian support during the wars against the Ottomans, the Russian government would attempt to limit Ukrainian self-government without outright antagonizing them. Their favorite method to do so was to encourage the conflicts between the hetman and the starshina, as well as to threaten the starshina with support to the peasantry. And any shortcomings from the Ukrainian administration or complaints against the starshina were used by the central government as an excuse to introduce Russian administrative changes that were promoted as improvements and needed for the public welfare. According to Subtelny, the Russian centralizing policies had three goals in Ukraine: to coerce the Ukrainian elite and general populace into complete obedience, to coordinate Ukrainian government, economy, and culture with those of Russia, and to extract the maximum from Ukraine's human and economic resources. The tightening grip can be observed, for example, with the election of Ivan Skoropadsky as hetman. Even though he had been implicated on Mazeppa plans and was committed to Ukraine authority, his election was accepted for he was seen as old and unaggressive. As soon as he had been elected, the Tsar increasingly appointed Russians to all sectors of power, including a Russian as a commander-in-chief of the Cossack army. The hetman residence was also moved closer to the Russian border, and large land holdings in Ukraine were acquired by Russians. The extraction of Ukrainian resources took various forms. Between 1709 and 1722, Ukrainians had to support 10 Russian regiments that were stationed in the land. Meanwhile, tens of thousands of Cossacks were sent to the north to work on the construction of the Ladoga Canal and the Tsar's new capital of St. Petersburg, under exceptionally harsh conditions in which many of them perished. In 1719, Ukrainians were forbidden to export their grain directly to the west. Instead, they had to ship it to the Russian-controlled ports of Riga and Arkhangelsk, where it was sold at a price set by the government. Finally, Russian merchants were given preferential treatment to export their goods to the Hetmanate, while Ukrainians had to pay huge duties on the items they shipped to the north. But the greatest shock for Ukrainians came in 1722, when the Little Russian Collegium, a Russian government body made up of 6 Russian officers based in Ukraine, was empowered to share power with the hetman. Shortly after traveling to St. Petersburg in hopes of convincing the Tsar to relent the implementation of the Collegium, the hetman died. With his death, the Starshina formally requested permission to elect a new hetman, whilst unofficially choosing Pavlo Polobotok as acting hetman. Yet the Tsar would refuse to hold any election as a vacant power benefited the Russian plans, with the allegation that there were no fit candidates for the position. Yet the new acting hetman took immediate action to prevent the Little Russian Collegium of exercising influence and continued to request an election for the new hetman, which the Tsar continued to refuse. In order to counter the Collegium influence, Polobotok took upon himself to address Ukrainian issues and complaints and reorganized the courts along collegial lines, forbade bribe-taking, and appointed inspectors to see that his orders were carried out. To reduce peasant complaints, he pressured the Starshina to act less blatantly in its exploitation of its subjects. These changes, initiated by the Ukrainians, greatly irritated the Tsar. In the summer of 1723, he summoned the acting hetman and his associates to the capital to explain their obstruction of the Collegium's work. Seeing a chance to undermine Polobot, Veliamnov, who was the chairman of the Collegium, persuaded several Ukrainians to lodge complaints against him and to request the introduction of Russian institutions in the Hetmanate. Polobotok's response was to send an emissary to Ukraine in order to organize a petition campaign that supported Ukrainian self-government. Infuriated with the overwhelming adherence, the Tsar imprisoned the acting hetman and all that had signed the petition. It would only be after Peter I's death that most of the imprisoned Starshina would be released. Yet, Polobotok was not one of the returnees, as he had died in his cell only a few months before Peter I's death. With Polobotok's death, the Collegium had free rein in the Hetmanate, introducing in 1722 direct taxation, which resulted in a 600% increase in taxes by 1724. But when the Collegium chairman started demanding that the Russians who owned land on the left bank also pay the new tax, said landowners such as Prince Menshikov shifted their position and spoke up in defense of Ukrainian self-government and criticized the Collegium. And, as by 1726 war with the Ottomans seemed imminent, other Russian officials adopted a more benign view of Ukrainian autonomy, as they did not want it to alienate Ukrainians. Menshikov's influence would lead the Imperial Council to dismantle the Little Russian Collegium and to decree the election of a new hetman to appease the population. It is under this conjecture that Danilo Apostol is elected hetman, but it did not amount for bigger concessions. In fact, the hetman's action was increasingly limited. A Russian resident was to supervise all foreign contacts with a Russian field marshal, controlling military affairs, and only the Tsar had the right to grant lands in the hetmanate. As Apostol realized that it was impossible to restore the hetmanate's political prerogatives, he concentrated his actions in improving the social and economic conditions. In 1728, a commission would be formed to codify the law, as the majority of Ukrainian law was still based on the Lithuanian statute of 16th century. It would only be in 1744 that the 18-man commission would complete a new codex entitled The Laws According to Which Little Russians Are Governed. By continuing the reform of the judicial system and establishing an office of the Treasury, it provided the Hetmanate its first annual budget. He supported Ukrainian commercial interests and was successful in protecting Ukrainian merchants from the unfair Russian competition and in reducing the heavy custom duties that had been imposed. He was also able to achieve some victories at a political level, regaining the right to appoint general staff and colonels, thus reducing the number of Russians and foreigners in his administration, and getting Kiev under his jurisdiction. In 1734, the conditions had improved to a degree in which the Zaporozhians, who had been exiled to Crimean territory since 1708, were able to return, albeit under Russian sovereignty. Apostol died in January 1734. And immediately after, the new Empress Anna Ivanova banned the election of hetmans and re-established the Collegium, this time named the Governing Council of the Hetman's Office. It was composed of 3 Russians and 3 Ukrainians, with the Russian president, Prince Tchaikovsky. The present orders were to persuade the populace that the previous hetmans were responsible for the taxes and mismanagement that proliferated in the hetmanate. The goal was to persuade Ukrainians that the abolition of the hetmanate was in their best interest. He was also ordered to encourage marriages between members of the Ukrainian Starshina and Russians, and in order to dilute their distinctiveness, in 1734 the entire city council of Kiev was confiscated of their ancient charters of rights, so that, in time, these birds will forget their contents and, lacking documents, will be unable to bring up the issue of their rights. In that same year, the Imperial Senate twice refused to confirm a Ukrainian as mayor of Kiev and acquiesced only after proof had been provided that there was no Russian in the city qualified for the post. During Anna's reign, alongside her favorite Ernst Byron, the left bank elite avoided public affairs, as the Russian political practices allowed that anyone suspected of even the slightest criticism or opposition to the Tsarist regime be taken to the dreaded secret chancellery for interrogation, torture, and possible exile or death. This practice was known as Slovo i Delo, Word and Deed Statute, and created an environment of mistrust even within families. Some of the greatest burdens suffered by Cossacks and peasants would be associated with the Russia-Turkish War of 1735-1739, as through the course of the war they were mobilized to aid in the war effort, resulting not only in high Ukrainian fatalities, but between 1737 and 1738, Ukraine had to maintain at its own expense 50 to 75 Russian regiments, which would cost the Hetmanate 10 times its annual budget. When Yelizaveta Petrovna rose to power in 1741, she stripped Byron of his power and influence and brought some small benefits to Ukraine. Her consort was Oleksiy Rozumovsky, a Cossack from the Hetmanate that had met the future empress when he was a singer in the imperial choir. Even though he avoided being involved in politics, his affection from his homeland, according to Subtelny, ended up rubbing off on the empress, especially after she was received in Kiev in 1744 with enthusiasm. When approached by the Starshina to approve the election of a new hetman, the empress' response was positive. Yet she would postpone it as she intended Alexei's younger brother to gather more experience and have him as a hetman. It would be in 1750 at Yulkiv that Kirill Rozumovsky was appointed hetman. It would be during this time that the hetmanate would experience some autonomy. As Kirill spent time away in St. Petersburg involved in the court politics, he maintained close contacts with the left bank. Realizing that the society of the hetmanate had become too complex for the Starshina to perform judicial as well as administrative and military functions, Rozumovsky started organizing a separate judiciary. In 1763, after much preparation, the hetmanate was divided into 20 judicial districts, each of which had courts specializing in criminal matters, boundary claims, and property conflicts. He succeeded in extending the hetman's authority over Kiev and the Zaporozhians and initiated an attempt to modernize the Cossack army. Plans were also drawn to establish a university in Baturin and to extend primary education to the sons of all Cossacks. Nonetheless, the political conjuncture of the time prevented its implementation. With the hetmans frequently away, the Starshina governed as they saw fit. It would be during Kirill's hetmancy that the Cossack elite would transition from an officer's corps to a typical nobility and began to call itself Shlichta. Even though Yelizaveta was more lenient towards Ukrainian matters, many requests and initiatives the hetman presented were refused. Some of said refused requests was the permission to establish diplomatic relations with the European courts and the request to have Ukrainian troops exempted from wars that did not directly affected or related to Ukrainian interests. During these more favorable times for the hetmanate's autonomy, imperial centralization was still pushed through. Subtelny highlights, for example, that in 1754 the budget of the hetmanate was taken under Russian control and the customs boundaries between Ukraine and Russia were eliminated. The distribution of land, for example, was a prerogative of the empress, making clear that Ukrainians were able to control their own affairs only to a certain extent. When Catherine II rose to power in 1762, Kirill returned to the hetmanate, and in 1763 he held a council with the Starshina at Vulkiv that aimed at discussing judicial reforms. This would soon expand to the consideration of the hetmanate decline regarding political prerogatives, resulting in a petition that called for their lost rights and the creation of a parliament of nobles on the left bank. The Ulfkiv petition was based on the premise that the hetman and Starshina considered the land to be a distinct political and economic entity linked to Russia only in the person of the monarch. In the view of Zenon Kuhut, the petition contained some of the most autonomous views publicly expressed since the time of Mazepa. Rozumovsky followed it up with a bold proposal that the emperors make the hetmancy hereditary in his family. The timing could not have been worse, as the empress was influenced by the writings of Teplov, Kirill's former tutor, that attacked Ukrainian autonomy, leading Catherine II to abolish Ukrainian autonomy altogether. She summoned Kirilo and demanded his resignation. His attempts to bargain were unsuccessful, ultimately resulting in his relinquishment of office on November 10, 1764. Catherine II finished the work that Peter I had begun in Ukraine. Like so many other rulers during the age of enlightened absolutism, she was convinced that a government based on the absolute principle and devoid of such feudal relics as special status for various regions was the most rational and efficient. Hence her negative attitude toward Ukrainian as well as Livonian and Finnish autonomy. For this, the Empress would choose Peter Rumianstev as a Governor-General to rule the left bank. At his assistance was the Second Little Russia Collegium, this time with 4 Russians and 4 members of the Starshina that the Russians trusted. The Empress was clear on her instructions to the Governor-General. He was not to arouse hatred for the Russians and was to prepare the ground for the elimination of Ukrainian autonomy. To do so, he was advised to fuel the idea within the peasantry that the worsening of their condition was the result of the backwardness of the Ukrainian way. He was also to enlist the Starshina with the prospect of attractive posts in the imperial government, equal status to the Russian nobility, and greater control over the peasantry. Rumiantsev initially avoided major changes and concentrated himself in raising a good image of the regime. He appointed numerous Ukrainians as his staff, introduced a postal service, and carried out a survey to assess the socio-economic conditions of the land. In haste to show how enlightened her regime was, Catherine II established in 1767 the Legislative Commission, where delegates from all sorts of society, with the exception of peasantry, from all regions of the regime, were assembled in Moscow and given the opportunity to present their views and desires to the Empress. To the Empress and Rumiantsev dismay, led by Hirori Politika, a number of Ukrainian delegates used the occasion to voice a desire for the renewal of the hetmancy and restitution of traditional Ukrainian rights. But Ukrainians were not the only ones with such a desire, as similar views were expressed by delegates from other bordering lands. Yet the Empress would be able to permanently postpone following meetings with the Commission, using the ensuing war with the Ottomans as pretext. Shortly after the Russo-Ottoman War of 1768-1775, Rumiantsev would take definitive steps to end with the Ottomanates. The first was aimed at the Zaporozhian Sich, which was destroyed in 1775 by a surprise attack from the Russians. After they returned under Russian sovereignty, in 1734, the Zaporozhians would regain their former lands and build a new Sich. Their return would be a mixed blessing for the Russians, for their performance in the wars against the Ottomans would lead the Empress to shower them with medals. Yet their lands free of serfdom would become a haven for runaway peasants. And whenever anti-noble uprisings flared up, the Zaporozhians were involved, offering refuge. As life settled, the vast lands owned by the Zaporozhians would develop large-scale farming, trading, and livestock raising. Activities largely dominated by the officers who grew wealthier. With it, socioeconomic distinctions would further develop between the Zaporozhian Starshina and the propertyless Rand and Fil, with conflicts often breaking between the poor and the rich in the Sich. The constant arrest and the siege obstruction to Russian efforts in colonizing the Black Sea littoral would lead Catherine II to order the destruction of the siege once again. On June 4, 1775, whilst the Zaporozhians were still at the Turkish front, the returning Russian army surrounded and destroyed the siege. About half the Zaporozhian lands were distributed among Russian grandees, and the remainder were assigned to German and Serbian colonists. Catherine II even attempted to obliterate the Zaporozhians from popular memory. When she announced their liquidation, she added that the use of the word Zaporozhian Cossack shall be considered by us as an insult to our imperial majesty. There is a postscript to the Zaporozhian story. The 5,000 Zaporozhians who fled to the Ottoman Empire were allowed to settle at the mouth of the Danube River. In 1784, to counterbalance their presence, the Russian government settled the remaining as ex-Zaporozhians between the Bu and Dniester rivers. In 1792, these Bu Cossacks were renamed the Black Sea Host and transferred to the Kuban. A part of the Danube Cossacks would return to the Russian Empire in 1828 and join their peers in Kudan. From 1864 until 1921, they would be known as Kuban Cossacks. Then, in 1781, the traditional 10 regiments districts of the left bank were abolished and instead were established 3 provinces: Kiev, Chernihiv, and Novosibirsk. In 1783, the Crimean Khanate would be absorbed by the Russian Empire, and in that same year would come the final blow to Ukraine: the abolition of the old Cossacks regiment and its replacement by the regular dragoon regiments in which peasants and non-Ukrainians were recruited for periods of 6 years. Contrary to government propaganda, the extension of the Russian imperial system to the left bank exacerbated rather than improved the plight of the Ukrainian peasantry. In 1783, they were deprived of the right to leave their landwards, just as Russian peasants had been long ago. In other words, the peasantry of the left bank now became formally unserved. Yet the Ukrainian elite benefited. Not only were the peasants now completely placed under their control, but in 1785 the elite was exempted from all government and military service, attaining thus equality with the Russian nobility. With so, there was little protest against the changes. One of such examples was Vasil Kapnitsk, that in 1791 tried to win Prussian support for the restitution of the Hetmanate, yet his attempts were not sufficient to prevent the absorption of Cossack Ukraine. It is not wrong to conclude that while Ukrainian aid was necessary to further the southward expansion, the Hetmanate was allowed to exist. Yet as the Treaty of Kushuk-Kynergy in 1774 concluded Russia's successful war with the Ottomans and recognized its presence in the Black Sea, as well as sovereignty over the Crimean Khanate, Ukrainian autonomy was no longer allowed to exist. Near anarchy encouraged by magnates and foreign powers who benefited from a weak central government reigned for most of the 18th century. Exploiting its role as the patron of the Commonwealth Orthodox, neighboring Russia was especially effective in foiling the efforts of Poles to reform and revitalize their state. Finally, the Commonwealth's 3 aggressive neighbors, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, moved in. In 1772, the Ukrainians of Galicia and Bukovina would be placed under Austrian rule, and by 1795, the entirety of the right bank had been incorporated into the Russian Empire. These changes in the political map of Eastern Europe would signal a new phase in Ukrainian history. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed and learned something new. Exploring a country's history is always exciting, yet worrisome when sharing information, for there's always so many layers of information that I constantly fear missing vital pieces of it. So please, if you ever find that there is some road I should explore, let me know in the comments below so I may look into it. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you didn't already, as it helps me please the algorithm of YouTube and grow this channel. But most importantly, stay safe.